Welcome to Crawford Art Gallery, Citizen Nowhere, Citizen Somewhere, The Imagined Nation, an exhibition curated by Dawn Williams, curator at Crawford Art Gallery. And I'm here today joined by Dawn, our curator, and Dr. John Borgonovo, UCC School of History. John was a critical friend to the Crawford in advising Dawn on some of the historical research on this important centenary exhibition. I'm going to just start the conversation, Dawn, by asking you a little bit about the premise of this exhibition. Very intriguing title.
So Citizen Nowhere, Citizen Somewhere, The Imagined Nation focuses on the legacy, the international legacy of Terence McSweeney and his hunger strike and his subsequent death. And it also prompts ideas around the imagined nation as offered by him in his essays, Principles of Freedom.
And Dawn, why in particular were you interested as curator in this kind of, I suppose, the contemporary world, the kind of impact of this major historical figure?
The interest came on learning about Terence McSweeney, but not only as a sort of an Irish political figure, but how his impact on such a global stage and this kind of huge propaganda machine that was kind of instigated and led on by Art O'Brien from London, and the connection between him, Terence McSweeney's wife Muriel, and his sister, especially Mary, and the three of them that basically amalgamated together to create this huge propaganda machine, obviously with the Irish Free State.
And John, we're here in front of this incredible kind of timeline, which I know as kind of research advisor to the project, you had quite an instrumental role in. Would you kind of pick us out a few points of interest in the kind of premise of the show in this storyboard for the public?
Well, if we think back to just even the 21st of January, the establishment of the first doll, we think of that in the Irish context as, Declaration of Independence, but it's a propaganda device to create international pressure to have Ireland's independence claim recognized in the Paris peace talks that occurred at the end of the First World War. And it's that international dimension to the independence movement that I don't think we quite have enough of an appreciation of. And when you think about Ireland, it had a global diaspora that was especially mobilized in the United States, but also in the UK and Australia. They had friends in France and Spain and Italy, and what they're trying to do is create enough international pressure that they'll be able to achieve independence, and that'll force the British government to surrendering Irish independence. And I don't quite think we've quite appreciated that, and this is a global moment for Ireland, for Cork, but also Terence McSweeney becomes this big international symbol to an extent that, I don't think we quite appreciate today.
Would you say, John, that he was one of the first kind of global political figures then? Because you've both used the word propaganda in your introductory words, and obviously it was quite a sophisticated networking communication system that was surrounding these figures.
Yeah, the hunger strike was quite modern. They used imagery, they used photography, they used newsreels, McSweeney's, they had daily updates. Mary McSweeney, who acted as kind of the spokesperson, is probably the best propagandist or the best orator in the Republican movement, a really sophisticated propagandist. And as Dawn said, Art O'Brien over in London also had a good understanding of how to frame the story. So that's a big part of it. And it's also there's a drama to it as a media story, because after about the 10th or 15th day of hunger strike, it was unknown how long McSweeney and the prisoners in Cork Men's Jail would last, and so that drama added to the human story. So it's a human story, really wrapped up in a political story.
And on the timeline here, are there moments that you would draw our attention to in particular?
Well, this one thing. I mean, keeping it real in Cork. Again, the assassination of Tomás McCurtain, which we always view as a Cork story, that was a big international story. And so it was global news for a number of days, including the inquest, including the funeral. And that created the position, that elevated the position of Cork Lord Mayor. So because of that, McSweeney's already a figure of global importance. And so when he joins the hunger strike, it adds an extra layer, an extra dimension to what's going on. I'd also point out a few things like we forget how important Ireland was to the global Catholic Church in places like the United States and places like America and Canada. And this is Bishop Daniel Mannix, who was a key figure in the Australian rejection of conscription in 1917 and 18. And he kind of comes over at the outset of the hunger strike and is denied access to land in Cove. He's actually taken off of a ship and relocated. And the kind of respectability of Irish church figures creates a moral base to some of this. And when we think about the hunger strike, had the Catholic Church come out against Terence McSweeney's hunger strike, it would have been viewed entirely different. And there was a lot of back and forth and a lot of mobilization of Irish clergy behind the scenes to make sure that the Pope didn't come down and call this suicide, which the Irish hierarchy would in the Irish Civil War. The Irish hierarchy called hunger strikes suicides and came out against them, including Bishop Cahalan of here in Cork. I think the Catholic imagery and the Catholicism of McSweeney, I think, plays as part of the overall package, if we want to call it, the media package, but the overall frame, and I think that's an element of it.
Dawn, you mentioned the role of the women in this story. Before we move from this area, do you want to say anything about kind of Muriel and the role of the women in the project?
Well, I just think, John could probably say more than I, but I just find through researching this project, I just found the women, just this relentless presence that they were forced into because of the actions of McSweeney, but hugely supportive of those actions. Mary, as John's already said, was this huge sort of independent woman of means, some means. She ran St. Eata's College, set that up, but also just this fierce sort of independent fighter, really. And Muriel, who married McSweeney against her family's wishes, deep wishes, and she married him a day after that she came into her inheritance. So that set her up as a sort of independent woman as means as well. So it's all these really kind of calculated, really strong women that are at the forefront. And also on a personal level, they are watching day by day in an international light their loved one perish.
Yeah, and when you think about, Mary and Muriel they're real feminists. And as you said, they're quite independent. And that kind of, they kind of terrify the British government to a certain extent, but they become these big figures because of their fearlessness. And that's part of it's part of the broader appeal to the story. And Muriel they often portray her as kind of the weak widow, but she's not that. She's something a lot more complicated than that.
2 days before McSweeney dies, she's not allowed access, or a day before, she's not allowed access to him. And her and Arto Brian basically march through to the British office, ministry office, and say, we need to see the minister right now, sort of thing. And he's sort of cowering in the background by all, through reading the newspaper reports and everything. So they're kind of really, they won't take no.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's interesting, that notion of large empire states, I suppose, not predicting where this emotional reaction was coming from, and I think that's what's really important about this story. We might move down to the Catalan Doll, because I'm quite interested in that as an object.
I just want to point out the Le Petit Journal, which is a popular illustrated kind of newspaper magazine in Paris, and there was the French were quite interested in McSweeney's hunger strike, as were the Italians. And Professor Grace Neville, who's a professor of French at UCC, has suggested that they were really impacted by the First World War and just death and wartime death in France. And then we can also think about the influenza epidemic that followed. and the kind of that blind mass death in 1918 and 19. And what Grace Neville suggested is that the moral choice of one person standing up and basically publicly dying on behalf of a political ideal really resonated deeply with people who had been affected by the First World War. And that kind of random death, wasted death, just completely by chance, misfortune, mass death. But here's somebody who's choosing death in a really public way for a very specific idea and doing it so in front of the world. And for whatever reason, that seemed to strike some kind of emotional chord or psychological chord in a big part of Europe that had been so deeply affected by the First World War.
John mentioned that it's a very visual movement, and we can see that the historical movement used the device of the visual very well. Can you tell us a little bit about the loans in the exhibition? There's a lot of historical works and contemporary works where we've secured some of the loans from.
Yeah. So some of the loans are from the V&A, the Victorian Album Museum in London, the Chairman Mao poster, and also the Sean Keating poster just to our right, which alludes to the Empire Marketing Board set up in 1926 as a way of promoting empire goods across the world, really. The Sean Keating and the Margaret Clark, they and James Humbert Craig, they were commissioned in 1927 to 29 to create these kind of posters that showed Ireland as this sort of place where remarkable fresh eggs could be acquired from, or butter, obviously with the court context. And then we moved through to the David Goldblatt images here behind John, which are of the South Africa Transvaal area in the late 60s and 80s, where there was this kind of mass through segregation. There was this mass movement of basically expelling black people from their situations to make way for white settlers. And then we also have works from the Tate, which are more contemporary works, through to the project room there of Olvind Fahlström and Gustav Metzger. And we also have the painting just around the corner of Lavery's a rather gorgeous Southwark Cathedral, which possibly is the first time it's been displayed in Cork. We don't know.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary image, and I suppose that's great institutional support for the exhibition. Can you comment a little bit on this intriguing object behind you, the doll, the Catalan doll?
So this doll is from Cork Public Museum. It's very intriguing. We've, for the exhibition, in collaboration with Cork Public Museum, we have had it restored to its as near as original state as one can get, and it's basically amazingly all handmade. The face is china. The legs are actually not china. They're not porcelain. They're actually a very new plastic of the time it was made in 1920. It was given to Maura McSweeney, the daughter of Terence and Muriel. It actually still has its own box in Cork Public Museum, so there's speculation whether it was played with, but we kind of think not, because of the book by Maura McSweeney suggests that she was given it later in life. But it is extraordinary gift from the Catalans, and it's from the Catalan trade union.
John, do you want to say anything about that? Because I suppose this notion of this gifting.
Well, the Catalans had a deep interest in what was going on in Ireland because of their own independence claims and interests in achieving independence. A crowd in Barcelona, crowds attacked and tried to burn down the British consulate after Terence McSweeney died. There's also was pretty significant interest in the Basque region as well. Again, nationalists who are seeing the Irish example as something to emulate. And even today, there's still interest in the Terence McSweeney story in Catalonia.
And John, like the way the information flew obviously was through the newspapers, telegrams, like the distribution of information was in somewhat slower potentially than we perceive today, where obviously there wasn't social media, but yet it seemed to have had a profound effect and maybe a longer term effect than the media channels of today where we're saturated with information. Is there anything kind of really intriguing around that information distribution at that period?
Well, people read a lot more newspapers. So it was really typical for people to read at least one, maybe 2 or 3 newspapers a day. It was massive interest in newspapers. Most newspapers had a morning edition and an evening edition, and every city would have multiple daily newspapers. So the way that the technology was, it was telegrams, and you would have daily updates. So you could pick up your newspaper in Buenos Aires in Argentina and read about what happened in Cork 12 hours or 20 hours previously. And so I think the daily reporting of Terence McSweeney's hunger strike was part of the reason it became such a big story. That again, there was a kind of a tension about it, just reading about it every day. And that's when you read the newspapers, it is reported internationally, and big newspapers, small newspapers around the world every day for 3 months, essentially. And so I think that's another reason it kind of resonated.
And also that reading of newspapers infiltrated to what many people did at the time was keep journals. So, and that informs the legacy of how those ideas of the fight for the Irish Free State, informs researchers in some capacity how the legacy of McSweeney kind of filtered out internationally. And I find that quite fascinating.
Because he's showing up in like Virginia Woolf and a lot of the literary figures are commenting on him.
Or indeed Marcus Garvey, that features quite prominently in the exhibition as well. So there's that really interesting narrative that's, like I say, informs the wider research of McSweeney's legacy.
Yeah, it becomes like a tip of the spear for anybody who's trying to form an independence movement. So the Indians. I mean, I hadn't realized how much of an influence the Irish had on the Harlem Renaissance, and they were kind of studying a bit of the Gaelic League and a lot of that stuff. And so the Irish example, the Irish are seen by colonized and oppressed people around the world as really successful at getting their message out. And so other movements in other parts of the world are studying what the Irish are doing and trying to emulate it and seeing what works and what doesn't work.
To the extent that the Marcus Garvey movement, the Negro Improvement Movement, as it was called, all their sort of meeting centres right across the states, etc., they were actually called Liberty Hall. Each one was called Liberty Hall, which is astounding.
And they refuse to offload British ships at some stage in New Jersey on the docks. Also out on the West Coast, there's a little bit of they're
to support McSweeney's cause.
Exactly.
Dawn, you mentioned the Sean Keating image. Was that a commissioned image? It's an intriguing image, very relevant in today's context of Brexit discussions.
They are commissioned by the Empire Marketing Board, as I said, and Sean Keating produced 2. Margaret Clark, I think, produced 3 images that I can remember, and James Humbert Craig also to promote the Irish goods abroad. So, and that kind of, we forget once you have a new state as Ireland was, which is where the contemporary comes into it with the contemporary artists in this exhibition, is what are the complexities of an imagined state as McSweeney had? What are the real realities of it? We have people currently in non-spaces like direct provision, and which is Anthony Hohey works with people collaboratively over years in direct provisions, which is a series here, and other works touch upon that kind of maybe the fallout of an imagined nation.
So I suppose you're bringing us on to that part of the exhibition, Dawn, the contemporary artists and how they're dealing with the imagination. And you've chosen to work with a number of artists who have made the works themselves. They're not commissioned by the state as such to make these artworks.
They're not commissioned, no. They're pre-existing artworks, but they strike a chord with those complexities, those realities of the idea of nation state. and perhaps some of them are actually quite dark in tone. You know, the reality of people becoming stateless. You know, there's millions in the world stateless now because their country ceases to exist, or and a third of these millions are children. There's also in Olvind Fahlström's work, which is borrowed from the Tate. Even though those works are nearly 50 years old, they speak of the soft power of, for example, the United States, and how that soft economic power directs and infiltrates other nation states, such as the states in South America. So there's this kind of ripple effect of the idea of nation state, as McSweeney would have had.
It's also quite interesting, John, I suppose, that contemporary artists, and it's interesting for your perspective as a historian on the contemporary side, I suppose they're continuing to make works which, when placed around the world, continue to raise and surface the issues that the very historical part of the show was doing.
Yeah, I mean, the big Irish message that went out is this idea of self-determination, and it's basically democratic governance and the idea that everybody deserves to have a voice in how they're governed. And that's a real universal message that still resonates. That the idea of self-determination is still a message that resonates, and that's still, in contemporary terms, it's still a radical idea because hasn't been fully achieved.
And I suppose that's something that we're very interested in this exhibition, is really aligning contemporary artists with this historical narrative and giving audiences different viewpoints, beginning to, I suppose, open up questions of exploration, and particularly the contemporary artists represented in the exhibition do that. I suppose also Dawn and the Crawford are very interested in curating shows that become part of knowledge production. And John, I'm going to ask both of you a final kind of question. On viewing the show in total, did you kind of learn anything new? Was there any kind of surprise for you in what this show has brought together?
I mean, I really liked what Dawn did in terms of the contemporary themes, or something I hadn't quite thought about, but they connect. And you know, when we think about Terence McSweeney, his big book is The Principles of Freedom. Yeah. And it's the idea of freedom isn't just a freedom to achieve a nation state, it's personal freedom, it's freedom to achieve an economic livelihood, to move without borders, to achieve racial justice, or you know, there's all these various manifestations of freedom, and one of the reasons McSweeney remains a relevant figure and remains an Irish global figure, perhaps one of the most influential Irish people ever, in which you think about global knowledge, is because he speaks to these individual as well as national freedoms and the struggle to achieve them.
Dawn, you did a lot of research. You've been embedded in this project for years. Are there any little surprising fun facts for you?
Well, I suppose for me, it comes down to humanity. And I suppose we kind of look at Terence McSweeney in slightly one-dimensional, as we kind of is common throughout the world in terms of nation building, nation state, and representing those ideals and those people. And for me, it's the humanity behind it, the conversations between his family, but also that knock-on effect to where we are now in this world of those that are without nation states, those that will never find nation states, and how can we go forward and, I don't know, find a better place, I suppose.
I love the image, one of your publicity images is the image of Terence McSweeney, not the typical one where he's kind of handsome and young, but he's old and weathered, and he's smiling. And
that was so important for me. That was so important to, it's hoped that those that are familiar with Terence McSweeney would be curious about that image, and those not, that might bring hopefully into the exhibition, because he's quite an approachable man by all accounts.
Yeah, and when you read, like I read a note in one of the archives where he talks about that newsreel coming in to film him, and he makes a joke about being a film star, and he's kind of joking around with whoever. And at the end of the day, these aren't just symbols and austere, they're ordinary living people. Yeah. And sometimes they catch the moment in a way, and it elevates them. But at the end of the day, there's something appealing about
Yeah.
McSweeney as an individual
Totally.
that still continues.